Hello and welcome to lesson 2 of the organisation topic. This lesson is called Digestion and Nutrients. I'm Mrs. Castanera and we're going to go through this today. So today's key words are salivary glands, esophagus, stomach, HCl, which means hydrochloric acid, liver, bile, intestines and nutrients. So let's highlight those, please. By the end of the lesson, you'll need to know what all of those words mean. So this here is the specification from your exam board that tells us everything you need to know about this topic or this contents that we're going to be going through this lesson. I'd like to start by having a go at the knowledge check, please. So if you could pause the video and answer those questions. Thank you. Okay, so let's review the answers to those questions. So place in order, biggest to smallest, system, cell, organ, tissue and organism. Okay, so biggest first is organism, then system, then organ, then tissue, then cell. So it needs to be in that order and all of them, please. Make sure you're ticking to show you've got these correct and marking them by adding in any correct answers that you've missed out and correcting things that aren't quite right. Question 2, identify what an organ system contains. So it contains different tissues that perform a specific function together. So the idea here is that organs, so there's two potential answers here. One is that an organ system contains different organs working together. Secondly, if you've just talked about what an organ is, it contains different tissues working together to do a job. Question 3, state what a group of cells working together is called. That is called tissue. Question 4, state the function of the xylem and the phloem. Well, as we discussed last lesson, the xylem transports water, it strengthens the plant, it also transports ions. So that's minerals, ions. And the phloem transports sugars, such as sucrose. I'll give you 2 marks for that because there are 2 different separate points there, one for what the xylem does, one for what the phloem does. State what piece of equipment is used to view cells. That would be a microscope. Question 6, describe the difference between an organ and an organ system. Okay, so multiple organs create an organ system. An organ is just a group of tissues, as described before, but an organ system is multiple organs. State the function of the circulatory system. Well, it circulates blood, transports oxygen, carbon dioxide and nutrients around the body. So again, you may not have all of the parts for this question, but add in anything you haven't got. And then once you've completed that, if you could give yourself a mark out of 8, remembering that there were 2 possible marks available for question 4. Okay, so let's move on. So today we are going to identify the positions and describe the functions and adaptation of the organs within the digestive system. We're also going to state the main nutrient molecules, their components and uses. So let's discuss nutrient food groups. So we are animals, humans count as animals. We are consumers. That means that we are consuming our energy needs. So that means that the nutrients in our bodies need to come from the foods that we eat. So it's very important, therefore, for us to have a knowledge and understanding of the different nutrient groups, their function, and which foods they come from. So we're going to have a look at the next page of information. So we're going to start with proteins. Proteins are large food molecules and they are made out of amino acids bonded together. Okay, so their main function is for the growth and repair. Okay, and that's growth and repair of cells and other tissues. They do have some other functions, including transport, support, so that's strengthening things, reproduction and immunity, but their primary answers for what is the job of proteins is going to be growth and repair. Now, amino acids can be absorbed by the body, and those are what proteins are made of, but proteins themselves are too big. Okay, so it has to be broken down. Protein must be broken down into amino acids to be absorbed. And next to this, we're going to draw a little diagram, okay, and it's going to show us roughly what a protein looks like. And so a protein is made up of different shapes, okay. I'm just going to use squares, rectangles, triangles, etc. Those aren't the real shapes of what proteins are made of, but this shows us that proteins are made out of different materials. Okay, and they're in a chain, a very long chain, okay, and that goes on and on and on. And each of the different proteins, so each of the different amino acids in our protein combines to make it have a particular function. So when digestion occurs, each of these amino acids, which is part of the protein chain, is detached from the chain into single amino acids that can then be absorbed into the body. Okay, we're going to move on to lipids, which is the scientific name for fats and oils. So these are large food molecules and they're made out of fatty acids and glycerol bonded together. And in fact, they look a little bit like this. Okay, it's just a representation. So we have a large oval glycerol, and attached to it we have 3 fatty acid chains, and these fatty acid chains look a little bit like zigzags. And so the whole thing looks a little bit like a jellyfish on its side. I'm going to label these. So this is the 3 fatty acid chains. And this main part here is the glycerol. Okay, so digestion will separate these, okay, because only the fatty acids and the glycerol can be absorbed into the body. Okay, so the lipids must be broken down by the process of digestion, again using enzymes. And the main function of these is for energy storage and insulation. Okay, we're going to move on to carbohydrates. Okay, so there's more than one type of carbohydrate that we're going to look at. Carbohydrate in the form of sugar and carbohydrate in the form of starch. Okay, so interestingly, we're going to look at carbohydrate in the form of sugar first. So sugar, it's small, soluble molecules, and these can just be digested, okay? So we draw a sugar molecule literally as a hexagon, okay? So this is a sugar molecule, sometimes called glucose, okay? And glucose is small enough to be absorbed by the body, so it doesn't need to be broken down. Okay, its main function is for energy. Okay, quick energy. You eat sugar, it gets digested, so absorbed into the body very quickly. Now, carbohydrates, starch, are much larger and they are not soluble. They're big, long chains of molecules made out of glucose molecules bonded together. Okay, now its main function again is for energy, but this time slow release. You may have heard about the glycemic index of foods, or low or high GI foods. So something that is low GI is something that's going to be mostly made of starch. It's going to be very slow release energy. Something that's high GI is going to be something that's made almost purely of sugar and it's going to be very quick energy. So plants also use starch as a storage molecule. Okay, that's how they store their sugars, because it isn't soluble. Plants are full of water, so they would have to store their sugars, which are soluble in water, in an insoluble form. So starch is the insoluble form of sugar, which is how plants store it. Now, only glucose can be absorbed, okay? So starch has to be broken down by the process of digestion, and that's very similar to what happens with the amino acids. So for this time, it's a chain of sugar molecules that are separated from each other. And in fact, we're going to just get a little ruler and we're going to just show what starch looks like, okay? So let's make sure we've labelled that so it's really clear that this diagram is for starch. And so it's going to be a chain made up of lots of hexagons. Now it can be quite tricky to draw, so I tend to do a big cross like an X, okay, and then join it together with 2 lines that are horizontal, and then another cross, and then 2 more horizontal lines, like so, until we get to the end of our chain when we stop, okay. And here we have our starch molecule, Okay, and each of these is an individual sugar molecule or glucose. And during digestion, some enzymes come out like a pair of scissors and they break it apart at these connection points. And that's what takes it from one long, indigestible train of molecules or chain of molecules into individual sugar molecules that can be digested. Okay, so make sure you've drawn all these diagrams, please. I'm going to move on now to vitamins and minerals. So, vitamins are small but very complex molecules. Their main function is to keep us healthy, okay? So we need them to maintain health. Vitamins and minerals are things that we can't make ourselves generally, okay? So we have to absorb them from other sources. Now, vitamin C is an example of a vitamin. It prevents something called scurvy, which is really important. So it keeps your skin and hair and nails and that very healthy, as well as your teeth. Vitamins are very small. They can easily be absorbed, okay, and they don't need to be broken down. Minerals, very similar to vitamins, are other small, simple molecules. They are elements. So when we say elements, we mean from the periodic table. Okay, and so these elements are things such as iron. We need iron to produce blood in our body. Okay, and so their main function again is to keep us healthy. Sometimes people categorize vitamins and minerals together because it's the same thing. These minerals are again small enough to be absorbed into the body. Okay, they're very similar vitamins and minerals, so they don't need to be broken down. So what I'd like you to do next is I'd like you to watch this video clip, okay, and on the student notes page, I'd like you to write down some of the information about the key functions of different organs within the digestive system in our bodies. Okay, so it looks to me like the student notes page is on page 24 of the booklets. Okay, so that's page 24. That's where you're going to be doing your notes here. Okay, so watch the video clip, please. Go to YouTube and pause the video whilst you do that. So we're going to look at the digestive system now. So last lesson we looked at the organisational hierarchy of a human. If you can remember the sort of chart we did there with the arrows, so the organism at the top, the largest part of it, most complex, all the way down to the individual cells. Now the digestive system is part of this organisation and it's also the biggest organ system. And if you recall from last lesson, it is 9 metres from mouth to anus. And it's how we gain the required nutrients from the previous list into our bodies. Without our digestive system, we would not be alive because we would not be able to get our nutrients into our bodies. So on this diagram here, there's a number of things that are written in red. Now I'm not going to highlight those in orange because you won't be able to see them. But as you can see, the salivary glands, I'm going to zoom in. So the salivary glands produce digestive enzymes such as amylase. The stomach is a site of digestion. The liver produces bile, which is stored in the bile duct. And then the pancreas produces digestive enzymes for all three, so amylase, protease, and lipase. That's the digestive enzymes for carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And then in the small intestine, after the pancreas, digestion occurs and the absorption of soluble products. So all of those individual amino acids and sugars, all of the things that we need, the vitamins, the minerals, they're absorbed at this point. The glycerol, the fatty acids. Now in the large intestine, all of these smaller soluble molecules have been absorbed at this point. And in the large intestine, we absorb water, okay, and the drier feces are then formed. Sometimes, if you have diarrhea, you might discover what your feces is like when it's still in the small intestine. It's much more liquid, much runnier, and that's because when you have diarrhea, the process of the movement of the feces through, that's poo, feces, through the large intestine is rushed and the water is not absorbed back into the body, and so what comes out during diarrhea is literally the liquid mixture of food and everything that's inside your small intestine normally. Okay, so without the large intestine, we would always have diarrhea. So the large intestine is very important because it keeps us hydrated. If we didn't have our large intestine, we would have to drink a lot more water all of the time, and we would be constantly dehydrated. So the stomach, as we've talked about this before, it contains glandular tissue. That's one of the 3 types of tissues. Okay, and the glandular tissue releases enzymes and hormones known as digestive juices to break down the food. And then there's the muscular tissue, which causes contractions that churn the food and turn it into smaller chunks. Okay, so the glandular tissue, there's 2 types. There's the one that releases the enzymes, such as the amylase, and there are also the ones that release the hydrochloric acid, which helps digest the food. Now we're going to look further down our page here at the human body. So we're looking at all the different parts included in the digestive system. So we've got the mouth. Okay, so the mouth is an organ because it contains a variety of different tissues, and where we chew to break down the food from bite-sized pieces into much smaller pieces. And then we have the salivary glands. Now, salivary glands are the first place where the enzyme amylase is released, and that starts the process of digestion, separating the sugars out of the starch molecules. Okay, so it starts to break it down. Also, saliva moistens the food. I know it sounds disgusting, but it adds water to it. So the esophagus, also sometimes called the gullet, that is the food tube. It's a muscular food pipe, and it pushes food along by a process called peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is essentially the rhythmic squeezing of the food pipe that forces the food along. The stomach, there are glands in the stomach which line the stomach, and they produce a protease enzyme called pepsin. Okay, and other glands produce hydrochloric acid, and the muscular stomach walls churn the food. The liver makes bile, and it's stored in the gallbladder. The bile breaks down lipids, so that's fats, into small droplets so that the enzymes can get to them easier. Now, this increases the surface area, and this process is called emulsifying. Okay, so it emulsifies fats. So emulsify, so that's break down into small droplets. So that's that process, to emulsify, to break down into small droplets, and that increases the surface area. The pancreas makes carbohydrates, also known as amylase. It also makes protease and lipase enzymes. So that is the enzymes to digest fat, protein, and carbohydrates. So the pancreas does everything. Then the small intestine. So the walls of the small intestine produce, again, carbohydrates, protease, and lipase enzymes to finish digestion. So the small intestine, as well as the pancreas, produces everything. And then the large intestine reabsorbs water back into the bloodstream to maintain hydration. And all of these parts are identified in this picture here. So your job is to make sure you know where each of these parts of the body is. So use the diagram to help you with that, and what they do. Okay, and also which enzymes are produced in each part. So that's quite a lot to learn here. And typical exam questions here would include identify organ X. So there'll be this diagram of the body, and there'll be a line to it saying X, or A and B and C. So identify the organs without any labels. So they'll expect you to identify which organs are there, or which part of the body produces carbohydrates. And you'll be expected to list which sections of the body produce carbohydrates, or amylase they might call it, or explain where each of the enzyme types are produced within the body. That would be a longer question, and again would require you to know the same information about where each of these enzymes is produced. So there's a lot to learn here and a lot to cover. So make sure you spend some time learning that. Okay, so we're going to move on now, and we're going to start on the checkpoint question on page 18. So explain how the pancreas and the gallbladder work together to increase the efficiency of fat digestion. So it asks you about the pancreas and the gallbladder and how they work together to increase the efficiency of fat digestion. So there are 6 marks there, that's 6 separate things that need to be said. You need to talk specifically about the pancreas and again also about the gallbladder and how they affect the digestion of fats and make it faster. Okay, so you're going to pause the video and answer this question and then we'll mark it together. Okay, let's go through that then. So there are any 6 of these things that are written here you can have. So you could say that lipids or fats are broken down by lipase. You could say that lipase is produced in the pancreas. You could say that bile is produced in the liver or that it's stored in the gallbladder. You could say that bile and lipase are both secreted or released into the small intestine. You can explain that bile neutralises the acid in food or the hydrochloric acid from the stomach. You could say that lipase works well or optimally in alkaline conditions or high pH. You could say that bile emulsifies the fat, that means turning it into tiny droplets. You could say that this emulsification, or turning the fat into tiny droplets, increases the surface area, or that it speeds up digestion. So there's a number of options there, so give yourself a mark out of 6, 1 mark for each of those points that you got. Now this was a very tricky question and it's very high level, so if you only got 3 or 4 of those, that's still a really good result, so don't feel bad if you didn't get all of them. Okay, now what I want you to do next is I want you to watch the following video on YouTube, and then I want you to complete the questions on page 18 going on to page 19. So pause the video please whilst you do that. Okay, let's go through those questions. State the other name for the esophagus. So the name for the esophagus is the gullet. Question 2, state where amylase is produced. So amylase is produced in 3 locations, the salivary glands, the pancreas and the small intestine. I'll accept any one of those, but please do write down all 3 of them if you haven't written all 3. State the large molecule broken down by amylase. Well, that would be starch into glucose. So the answer is starch, but I'm letting you know that it's turned into glucose. Question 4, suggest where water is reabsorbed into the blood. Well, that would be the large intestine, not just the intestine, but the large intestine. You won't get the mark just for saying intestine. Suggest where digested food is absorbed into the blood. Well, that would be the small intestine. Again, you must say small, not just intestine. Question 6, state what is produced by the pancreas. So for this one, you'll need all 3. So amylase, that's carbohydrates by another name, proteases and lipases. Okay, so it's still only 1 mark there, so I shouldn't have ticked it twice. And you will need all 3 there, so please add in anything you've missed. Question 7, suggest the name of the acid made in the stomach. That's hydrochloric acid, or if you've written capital H, capital C, lowercase l. Okay, that's a lowercase l, not a capital. Question 8, state the enzyme secreted by the stomach lining. That would be protease or pepsin. Either of those is worth the mark. Now, moving on to question 9 on the next page. State what is made by the liver. Well, the liver makes bile. Question 10, state where this substance, bile, is stored. Well, that would be the gallbladder. And question 11, suggest what this substance, bile, what does it actually do to lipids? Well, it emulsifies it. Okay, so that's worth a mark. Or you can say turns it into small droplets. And the reason for this is to give it a large surface area. So if you could give yourself a mark out of 11 for all of those, please. And then we're going to move on. Okay, so next up is this exam style questions, and what I would like you to do is answer the questions that are on pages 19, 20 and 21. So 3 pages of exam style questions. I'd like you to answer these questions, please. Pause the video whilst you do that. It's going to take you a little while, and that's fine, and then we'll go through them together. Okay, let's go through those. Question 1. Figure 1 shows the human digestive system. Okay, so here we have part A, B, C, D and E labelled. So which organ in figure 1 produces acid? Well, we know that the stomach produces acid, and that is C. So the answer to question 1 is C. So if you got that correct, tick it, circle the mark. Okay, if you didn't get it correct, please correct it in another coloured pen. Question 2, which organ from figure 1 produces bile? Well, you should know that's the gallbladder or the liver, okay, and that is B. Okay, so again, if you got B, well done, give yourself a tick for the mark and circle the point. Question 3, where in figure 1 are digestive foods absorbed into the blood? Well, they're absorbed into the blood in the small intestine, which is part E. So again, if you got E correct, give it a tick and give yourself the mark. Okay, so we've got mark out of 3 for the first part of the question. And then we're going to move on to the next page. So, food molecules, such as proteins, cannot be absorbed unless they are digested. Give one reason why. So we can zoom in a bit more. Okay, so the reason is that they are too large to pass through the walls of the blood vessels lining the stomach. They have to be broken down. So it's about them being too big or too large. So if you got that right, give yourself a tick and circle the point. Okay, so next question. So here we have a scientist that's investigated the effect of pH on the activity of 2 protease enzymes. Figure 2, this graph, shows the results. So it shows us the rate of enzyme activity in the arbitrary units, so it just means they don't really have units, so up this axis, and across the bottom we have pH. Now enzyme X is labelled here, and enzyme Y is labelled here, and it's asking what is the optimum pH for enzyme Y? Well, it's 7.5, and I'll go through now how we worked that out. So first off, you take a ruler and you identify enzyme Y. Now the optimal pH for this enzyme is going to be the pH at which it has the highest rate of activity. So for this one, and we'll find a pen to do this in so you can see it. For this one, that point is up here. Okay, so at the peak of this graph. Now we're going to take our ruler and draw a line down from the peak of this graph straight down here, and that puts us slap bang in the middle of 7 and 8 for pH, and that pH is 7.5, and so we've written that there. I will accept any answer from 7.4 to 7.6. Okay, so that's worth 1 mark. So any answer from 7.4 to 7.6. Next question. Where in the digestive system might 2 protease enzymes be produced? Okay, so the enzyme X and enzyme Y are both protease enzymes, and you need to know that where they're produced. And so enzyme X, working around about pH 2, is likely to be produced in the stomach. Okay, and enzyme Y, which is closer to neutral, is much more likely to be produced in the small intestine, because these are the conditions of these parts of the body. So the stomach is around about pH 2 or 3, and the small intestine is around about pH 7 or 8. So that's why we've chosen this bottom one here. So give yourself a mark for that one if you got it right. Now, figure 3 is across, this next question is across 2 pages, so don't worry too much. So figure 3 shows the model of an enzyme molecule. Okay, and you can see the shape along here. This is the important part. So you see the shape of a square, and then the shape of a triangle, and then another triangle. And that's really important. So knowing that we've got a square, a triangle, and a triangle. So you can draw a line here and you can see those three shapes: square, triangle, triangle. So the question asks us which substrate fits into the enzyme molecule in figure 3. So we are looking for a square, a triangle, and a triangle again, all in a row. Okay, so we're only going to be getting onto one side of this. So which one can you see with a square, a triangle, and a triangle in a row? Well, here we have square, or in fact rectangle, triangle because it's a diamond, there's the triangle shape, and then another triangle shape. And we can draw that outline that we've just seen in that enzyme. There we go, that's the shape from our enzyme that is going to attach to this substrate. So if you got that correct, give it a tick and give yourself a mark. Okay, so the next question says, the enzyme and substrate diagrams are used as a model for a theory of enzyme action. What is the name of this theory? Well, the name of this theory is the lock and key theory. Okay, and if you got that right, again, give yourself the mark. Well done. Next question. If the pH changes too far from the explain why the pH affects enzyme activity. So why does pH affect enzyme activity? Well, if the pH changes too far from the optimum being where it works best, then the bonds holding the enzyme together will weaken, and that changes the shape of the active site. So the enzyme becomes denatured, that's just that it's changed shape, and stops working. Okay, so we're talking about the idea if the bonds change or the shape of the active site changes, the idea the enzyme becomes denatured or stops working. So there's 2 marks here, one for talking about the bonds changing or the shape of the active site changing, so that's our first mark. And the second mark is saying that the enzyme becomes denatured or stops working. So there's 2 marks there. So make sure you give yourself 2 separate marks there. And this whole thing is out a total of 10 marks. So add them up and see how many you got out of 10 and give yourself the mark. Okay, so once you've done that, we're going to move on to the knowledge and application check on page 22. Okay, so there are 10 questions. I want you to pause the video whilst you answer those questions, please. Okay, so let's go through those then. Question 1. Identify the molecules that form proteins. Well, that would be amino acids. Proteins are chains of amino acids connected to each other. Question 2. Identify the molecules that form lipids. So there are 2 molecules, fatty acids and glycerol. Okay, you'll need both of them for the mark. I know I've ticked it twice, but you'll need both of them for 1 mark. Question 3. Identify the role of the stomach in digestion. Okay, so it's breaking them down into smaller pieces that can be digested for 1 mark. Question 4. State what glandular tissue produces. So glandular tissue produces hormones or enzymes. Either of those is acceptable for the mark, but if you've missed anything, please make sure you're writing them down in addition to that. You can have it right and still add to your answer to improve it. Question 5. State how the bolus, that's the lump of food, moves down the esophagus. Okay, so that process of squeezing the food down the esophagus is called peristalsis. Spelling isn't a major important factor here, as long as you can tell that the word is peristalsis. So if there's a small spelling error or even a couple of little errors, as long as it looks and reads similar to peristalsis, then you will get the mark. Question 6. True or false? Food enters the pancreas. Well, this is false. Nothing enters the pancreas in terms of food, but it does release things into the food from the pancreas, but nothing goes into it. Question 7. State the function of ribosomes. Well, ribosomes produce proteins. This isn't something that we have done this lesson. This is from a previous topic, but you do need to know that ribosomes produce proteins. They take those amino acids that we've absorbed and digested, and they connect them to each other, they string them together to make proteins. It's essentially digestion in reverse. Question 8. State what the cell wall is made of. Okay, so the cell wall is made of cellulose. Cell walls are found in plants, not animals. Question 9. Blood contains white blood cells, red blood cells, plasma and platelets. In hierarchical organisation, I think that's a full stop. In hierarchical organisation, what definition would you give it? Explain your answer. So blood is a tissue. It's got different specialised cells all working together to perform a particular job or function. So there's 2 marks here, 1 for saying tissue, because that's correct, and 1 for explaining that it's because it has different cells that work together to do something. Okay, job, function, etc. So tissue for the first mark, for the second mark, the idea it's different cells working together. Question 10. Explain why the stomach contains 3 types of tissue and the function of each type in digestion. So each type is the muscular tissue is the first one. The glands is the second one. There's 2 types of glands. And the reasons for these is the muscular tissue churns the food. Okay. And there's a gland to produce pepsin. Okay. And there's a gland to produce hydrochloric acid. So the glands to produce enzymes. If you haven't said pepsin, enzymes is fine. And the glands that produce, even if you've just said acid, that's fine. Okay, so really there's 5 things you can say here. Okay, but it would probably only be out of 4. So give yourself a mark out of 4 for this question and a mark out of 2 for the question above. So adding that all together, there are 14 marks available for this. So give yourself a mark out of 14 for the whole thing. So if you've got 4 or less on that, you really need to review the questions here and go over it again and make sure you're learning the answers better than you were. If you've got up to 10, then you've done very well. If you've got more than 10, you've done exceptionally well. Well done. Now, before we finish, I'd like to go through the keywords and their definitions. They're listed on the final page. There's quite a lot of information here. You need to know what each of these keywords are. You need to know a little bit about each. So the salivary glands, you need to explain what they are, what they do, what they produce. The same goes for all of these. This is very similar to previous learning content I've given you to work for. Okay, so make sure you know these. It doesn't have to be word for word perfect, but you need to be able to define and tell me what the stomach is, what it does and how it does that. So different types of tissue and all the rest of it. And it's all detailed here. Okay, so make sure that you've learnt this information. It's very important. If you do that, you shouldn't have any problem passing your exams. And that concludes our lesson. Thank you very much.